Thank you, everyone. Yes, as Kirsty said, my name's Lesley. I'm a public health researcher with a microbiology background, and I was tasked with looking at a data set that contained GP electronic medical records and looking at that for the antibiotic prescriptions. So just a bit of background. I wasn't sure how much we'd have beforehand, but I think this will still fit in. Our current existing data sets for antibiotic prescribing are not really adequate. We have two data set sources. The first of those is our dispensed antibiotics from the PBS Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. A little bit like our Canadian colleagues we heard earlier, it's the dispensed prescriptions, but it covers the majority of our community dispensed prescriptions, but there is no data collected at all on the reason for the prescription. We do not know the indication. The only demographic data we have is the postcode of the patient. And this data does not include what we call private prescriptions. So GPs who can, or other specialists, so I'll come back to private prescriptions. This data also includes prescriptions written by other community specialists as well, and it can include hospital discharge patients as well. So it's not purely a GP data set. Now, the private prescriptions can be written by GPs or other community prescribers, and these are where the prescription is written not as a subsidised source. So it might be for things like travel medicine, in which case then the patient pays the full cost of the medication, or it might be that the GP, certain antibiotics like all of our fluoroquinolones are authority prescriptions. So if you want to write a prescription for it, you have to ring Canberra, get an authority, and then you can prescribe it. However, you have the option as well that you can write it as a private prescription and the patient will bear the full cost. But as antibiotics aren't horrifically expensive, that isn't much of a deterrent. And we don't have accurate figures on our private prescriptions. The last data came from 2011 and they were about 7% then. So it's not a great data source because we can't, it doesn't release the GP prescriptions only. The other data source we have that's current is from what we call the Medicine Insight program. This is run by the NPS MedicineWise system. This looks at GP electronic medical records. So it does include things like reasons, it includes demographic data, and it includes all prescriptions that a GP will write. However, it's a voluntary program. GPs do not have to belong to it. And in their most recent data set, they found that 7% of the practices, 14% of GPs, and covers 13% of the Australian population. So it's not huge. And we do not have any links between what is prescribed and what is dispensed at this stage. So we can't link them. So all we know is these are prescribed, not that they're necessarily dispensed. And we can tell if the GP's written repeat prescriptions, and we know in some cases repeats are dispensed, but not all repeats are dispensed. And this data is publicly available in the AURA, the reports, the Antimicrobial Use and Resistance in Australia reports. And I think Joanne's touched on some of this. We know that we're a high consuming population as regard antibiotics. It is coming down, and in the most recent figure, 41.5% of us took an antibiotic in the year 2017, took at least one antibiotic. And they looked at things like the reason for prescription field, the diagnosis field, the reason for encounter field, to try and match those with a reason for the prescription, and still found that 30% could not be associated with any reason for the script. A bit like some of Karen's data. You can see her smiling and nodding. And their three most frequently prescribed antibiotics were cefalexin, amoxicillin, and amoxicillin clavulanic acid. So we like not just prescribing antibiotics, but we like consuming broad spectrum antibiotics too. And for amoxicillin and amoxicillin clavulanic acid, they were higher in winter. So I came along to look at GP electronic medical records to see if we could improve on these data sources. So this was published a year ago in the Australian Journal of General Practice. And my aim was to describe antibiotic prescribing from GP electronic medical records to see if we could identify any antimicrobial stewardship targets. It was a pilot data set up for GP quality improvement activities. Used the electronic medical records, so it's longitudinal. We could track patients over time. And it was a data set comprised of 50 general practices from Melbourne's inner east, so it's very localised. It was originally called the Magnet data set, and since the pilot, it's been rolled out into what's called Polar now. The data that's collected is, of course, de-identified. It can link patients across participating practices, which Medicine Insight does not do, or it can, but the problem is with only 7% of practices, it needs to have local practices because patients don't normally go interstate necessarily unless they're on holidays to go to the doctor. Whereas this one is more localised, it's got a better chance of picking up a patient visiting another practice. I should say in Australia, unlike England, you can go to any GP, any practice that can take you. So we're not restricted at all. I looked at all antibiotic prescriptions, including topical, except for chloramphenicol, some of which is also available off prescription. And I looked at 5 years worth of data from 2010 to 14. The results, I had complete year results for 44 general practices over that time, which was over 600,000 antibiotic prescriptions for over 166,000 patients. There were a wide range of antibiotics prescribed. Cefalexin was the most commonly prescribed, and that was nearly 25, nearly a quarter of all the prescriptions. The 10 most frequently prescribed antibiotics were 84% of the total. So let's just have a look at the top 5 most frequently prescribed antibiotics. That's cefalexin, amoxicillin clavulanic acid, roxithromycin, doxycycline, and clarithromycin. Together, they accounted for 65% of all antibiotics prescribed. And we'll have a look at these now tracked over the seasons. You can see at the top in blue, cefalexin. In orange, we have amoxicillin clavulanic acid. In the grey, we have roxithromycin. In the yellow, doxycycline, and at the bottom in blue is clarithromycin. Yes, that's right. It's just all hidden from me and you. Sorry about that. You can see cefalexin is fairly constant across the seasons, whereas for the other 4 antibiotics, there are these marked peaks in the middle of the year, which is our winter. So we have winter prescribing peaks for 4 of our 5 most frequently prescribed antibiotics. The other interesting thing to note, can you see the pointer on your screen? Yes. Is roxithromycin here in the grey had a peak in 2010 and each year has come down to 2014 here, but there is still a peak for roxithromycin. And just to preempt some of the other results, what happened in 2010 is we had a guideline update, which roxithromycin before 2010 was a first-line antibiotic for the treatment of pneumonia. That changed in 2010 to no longer be a first-line antibiotic, and you can see why it has declined, but none of the others really have changed in frequency. So We saw cefalexin fairly constant across the year, which would imply it's perhaps being used for things like urinary tract infections or skin and soft tissue infections. Whereas in our guidelines at that time for skin and soft tissue infections, flucloxacillin was the first line recommended antibiotic. But it doesn't look as if this cohort of GPs either don't see skin and soft tissue infections, or they don't seem to prescribe flucloxacillin as much as they like cefalexin for that. The other thing to note is amoxicillin clavulanic acid. We saw those marked peaks, and it was the second most frequently prescribed antibiotics. And in our guidelines at the time, co-amoxicillin clavulanic acid was a first-line antibiotic for urinary tract infections at that time. But otherwise, it was only a first-line, an antibiotic if amoxicillin was the first-line antibiotic for most other conditions. And if amoxicillin treatment failed, then co-amoxicillin clav was the recommended go-to. But it doesn't look as if it's being used that way. And also it was not a first-line treatment for respiratory tract infections. And remember, we saw those huge winter peaks. Guideline concordance. As I said, even looking at every possible field in the ORA reports, 30% of prescriptions could not be matched to anything for a guideline concordant check. I looked at a slightly smaller subset of my practices, 39 practices with nearly 600,000 antibiotic prescriptions. I only looked at the one field, the actual reason for prescription field, and that was really poorly used by GPs. And I've learnt from Joanne that that box is one that comes up after the GP has prescribed the antibiotic. It comes up as an optional box for the GP. It is also in some softwares free text, so it makes it very difficult to analyse that data. In some software you could see that it was a coded box because there were different codes, and of course the software all seemed to use different codes. So there were a couple of main codes presumably for different softwares, but the rest of it was free text, abbreviations, all sorts of things. So in the end, we decided not to proceed with this analysis because it would not have been meaningful, and it was too hard in my time frame to try and look at the free text fields. So we have some antimicrobial stewardship targets from that data set. We can quite clearly see that there are broad-spectrum antibiotics preferred, such as comparing cefalexin, 25% of the prescriptions, to flucloxacillin being only 2%, co-amoxiclav 15% as against amoxicillin 1%, and phenoxymethylpenicillin 4%. And this compares with Europe, for instance, where penicillins are their most frequently prescribed antibiotics, and especially in Sweden, phenoxymethylpenicillin is their most frequently prescribed antibiotic. We also have these really high winter prescribing peaks, as you saw, which presumably are for respiratory tract infections. Now, obviously, some of those patients will have pneumonia, and antibiotics are quite correctly indicated for that. But the vast majority of respiratory infections are in fact self-limiting, for which antibiotics are mostly unnecessary. And I mentioned that roxithromycin winter peak, still peaking in 2014. So it would imply that there's poor awareness of our recommendation changes. And as Joanne's already pointed out, therapeutic guidelines, which has our recommended antibiotics, does not integrate into GP software. So it's not convenient for GPs to use, as is MIMS, which is integrated into GP software. Of course, there are limitations. It's where the data is stored in the medical software. We really need information on reasons for prescription, and it needs to be in a field that works in with the GP workflow and gives the GP useful information. We don't want just an add-on, another step for a GP. You're in a consult and they spend all their time looking at the computer. We don't want just an add-on. We need something that's useful for them and that will give us the data we need as well. And it should not, apart from not being an option, it should not have free text, which makes it difficult then. The GPs have to know the coding for each disease they see. So it's got to be something intuitive. Otherwise, it's just adding more headaches on your limited time with the GP. And while 44 practices is not generalisable, it gives you local information. It gives the people who are working with those local practices information about what those practices are doing. So it identifies local stewardship information. So even though it's just low-hanging fruit, we do have some targets. We know we're consuming broad-spectrum antibiotics. There are the winter peaks, respiratory tract infections. We need to improve our access that GPs can get to therapeutic guidelines. They need to be better informed about the changes in the recommendations. We're obviously not reaching all GPs. And to go further with this, we really need to find better ways of getting the reason for the prescription. We cannot access patient notes because that's potentially identifiable. We are limited only to the fields that the GP fills in, and these are obviously not necessarily all useful. Acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge Outcome Health for access to the data set, the GPs who participated in this, and of course the NHMRC funding for this. And that's my details there.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Any questions? Can we invite any questions from the audience for Lesley?